You are standing in a palace that no longer belongs to you. The floors are yours, but the doors are not. The soldiers outside do not bow. They watch. You were a pharaoh this morning. By nightfall, you are inventory. The walls have not changed, but the air has. Something has been subtracted from the room, and it is not furniture. It is future. This is August 30 BC. Alexandria has fallen without fire. And Cleopatra, the woman who commanded fleets and spoke 9 languages, who negotiated with Caesar and stabilized a dynasty for 21 years, is about to experience something far more complete than execution. She is about to be processed. Before we go deeper, I have to say, it still amazes me that a story this old, from a palace that no longer exists, can reach people in Tokyo, São Paulo, Manchester, Lagos. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It genuinely moves me every time. When Octavian's forces entered Alexandria on the 1st of August, they did not storm the gates. They transferred administration, no siege, no breach. The transition was bureaucratic, and that should have been the first warning. Cleopatra remained inside her palace, but the palace had been reclassified. Roman soldiers arrived in formation, not as invaders, but as personnel. They did not destroy. They occupied. Entrances were reassigned. Interior corridors were mapped. Certain rooms were sealed. Others were cleared. Guards were posted at intervals described in Plutarch's accounts, not to protect her, but to monitor her. This was not imprisonment. It was specimen management. Every ancient source agrees on this. Sharp objects were removed. Mirrors were taken. Cosmetics were inspected. Food was examined before delivery. She could move within designated areas. She could speak to attendants if those attendants were approved. She could send messages; those messages were reviewed. Every action required permission. Every permission was delayed. The palace still looked like her palace. Her furniture remained. Her belongings were visible, but the structure itself had been recategorized. It was no longer a seat of power. It was a holding facility. And outside, Alexandria continued. Markets functioned. Temples opened. Grain shipments moved through the harbor. Roman administrators cataloged tax records, mapped property lines, interviewed officials. The city adapted. Inside, time stopped. Cleopatra was not interrogated, not tortured, not even accused. She was maintained. And this maintenance had a purpose so calculated that it would take weeks for her to understand it. She sent requests to meet with Octavian. Those requests were acknowledged, not answered, not onaged. Letters were delivered. Responses were delayed. Proposals were submitted. Decisions were postponed. Roman power did not operate through refusal. It operated through the management of time. Her daily routine became structured by absence. Meals arrived at irregular intervals. Attendants were present but rotated without pattern. Requests were logged but fulfillment was suspended. The palace she had known for decades was reorganized into zones of permission. Certain corridors were accessible, others were not. Some rooms remained furnished, others were emptied overnight. This was spatial redefinition. For 21 years, Cleopatra had governed Egypt. She had commanded naval operations at Actium. She had negotiated alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She spoke Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Troglodyte, Ethiopian, Arabic, and Persian. She had overseen famine, relief, economic reform, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic summits spanning 3 continents. None of that knowledge applied now. She could not negotiate with guards following orders. She could not command soldiers outside her authority. She could not leverage relationships that no longer existed. Every tool she had used to maintain power, persuasion, alliance, financial leverage, strategic delay had been removed from the equation. What remained was her physical presence, and Rome had already calculated the exact value of that presence. While Cleopatra remained under guard, Rome was rewriting her identity. This process had begun years earlier. After Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's propaganda machine had systematically redefined Cleopatra in Roman consciousness. Official documents avoided her royal titles. Public speeches described her not as a monarch, but as a foreign influence. Coins stopped bearing her image. Written accounts emphasized seduction over statecraft. Her capture did not create this narrative. It finalized it. For Roman audiences, she was no longer the pharaoh of Egypt, the descendant of Ptolemy, the co-regent who had stabilized a fractured dynasty. She was an enemy of the state, documented, verified, and soon to be displayed. Roman law required physical evidence for a triumph. Victory was not declared. It was demonstrated. Enemies were presented in sequence. First their weapons, then their treasures, then their leaders. Cleopatra was being preserved for that sequence. But preservation required transformation, from ruler to exhibit. This transformation happened through language. Roman officials stopped addressing her by title. Messages referred to her as the Egyptian or the woman. Diplomatic protocols that had once governed interactions with foreign monarchs were replaced with instructions for handling captives. Her authority was not stripped. It was reclassified. Inside the palace, this reclassification had physical consequences. Items associated with royal function were removed first. Seals were confiscated. Ceremonial objects were catalogued. Official correspondence was collected. Anything indicating administrative power was separated from her quarters. What remained were personal effects, but even these were sorted. Jewelry was inventoried. Cosmetics were examined. Clothing was inspected. The distinction between personal property and state assets was being determined by Roman assessors. Cleopatra was present during this process. She could observe the categorization of her own belongings, but she could not contest it. On August 3rd, 2 days after the occupation began, Cleopatra was granted an audience with Octavian. This was not a negotiation. It was an inspection. The meeting took place inside her own palace, but the room had been cleared by Roman soldiers. Guards stood at every entrance. The furniture had been rearranged. The space she had controlled for 2 decades was now configured for Roman purposes. Octavian entered with scribes, not advisor scribes. The meeting was being documented. Ancient sources provide fragments of what was discussed. Cleopatra reportedly attempted to justify her alliance with Mark Antony. She presented financial records. She offered access to royal treasuries. She proposed terms for her children's safety. Octavian listened. He did not refuse her requests. He did not accept them. He acknowledged them. Then he left. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No agreements were formalized. No promises were made. No timeline was established. But the meeting served a function. It confirmed that Cleopatra still believed negotiation was possible. And that belief was useful to Rombi because it meant she would continue behaving as though outcomes were still undecided. As long as she believed resolution was pending, she would remain compliant. She would not attempt escape. She would not organize resistance. She would wait. And waiting was exactly what Rome needed her to do. After the meeting, Plutarch records that Cleopatra believed she had made progress. She thought Octavian had shown clemency. She interpreted his restraint as flexibility. But Octavian's restraint was not clemency. It was scheduling. He had already determined her fate. He simply had not disclosed the timeline. Cleopatra's position had never rested solely on her own authority. It rested on succession. Her eldest son, Caesarion, publicly acknowledged as the biological child of Julius Caesar, represented a problem Rome could not parade. His existence complicated Octavian's narrative. If Julius Caesar had a legitimate heir, Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy became disputable. A living son with royal and Roman lineage created a potential rallying point for opposition. Caesarion was 17 years old in 30 BC. He was sent away from Alexandria before the city fell. Evacuated south toward the Red Sea with instructions to reach India if necessary. But he was recalled. Sources conflict on whether he returned voluntarily or was intercepted. What is certain, he was executed shortly after. The method is not recorded in detail. The decision was Octavian's. His advisor Arius is quoted by Plutarch. Too many Caesars is not good. Caesarion was removed from the equation. The other children were not. Cleopatra had 3 younger children with Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, age 10, Cleopatra Selene, age 10, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, age 6. They were taken into Roman custody alive, not as prisoners in the traditional sense. They were reassigned. Roman practice did not automatically execute the children of defeated enemies. It absorbed them. They were transported to Rome, placed in households, and raised under Roman supervision. Cleopatra Selene would later be married to Juba II, the Roman-appointed king of Mauritania. She would govern as queen, mint coins with her image, and produce heirs who would integrate into Roman imperial lineage. But that future was not presented to Cleopatra as reassurance. It was presented as removal. Her children would survive, but not as Egyptians, not as Ptolemies, not as heirs to her dynasty. They would continue as Roman assets. For Cleopatra, this clarified the terms of her situation. Rome did not need to kill her children to neutralize them. It only needed to relocate them. And once they were relocated, her leverage disappeared. She could not negotiate for their safety. They were already secure. She could not bargain for their release. They were already being processed. She could not protect their future because that future was now being determined by Rome. This was not a threat. It was inventory redistribution. The separation happened gradually. First, the children were moved to different quarters within the palace. Then they were assigned Roman attendants. Then their daily schedules were restructured. Then they were taught Latin. Cleopatra was permitted to see them, but only at designated times. And those times became less frequent. Not as punishment, as transition. The children were being prepared for transport. They needed to be detached from Egyptian identity before they could be integrated into Roman society. That detachment required the removal of maternal influence. So visits were reduced, then supervised, then discontinued. By the time Cleopatra died, her children had already been relocated to a separate facility. They were not present when she died. They were already Roman property. Octavian's intention was clear from the moment Alexandria fell. Cleopatra would be brought to Rome alive, displayed, then archived. Roman triumphs followed strict procedural order. They were not celebrations. They were bureaucratic demonstrations of conquest. Every element was catalogued. Every participant had a designated position. The sequence was rigid. Magistrates and Senate members, trumpeters, carts carrying spoils, visual representations of conquered territories, sacrificial animals, captive leaders in chains, the victorious general, and the army. Cleopatra would have walked in position 6 not immediately, not first. Last among the captives, after lesser officials, after symbolic figures, after anyone who could be presented as subordinate to her. The delay between positions was intentional. It allowed crowds to process each element. It created anticipation. It extended the duration of humiliation. Roman triumphs could last hours. Cleopatra would have spent that entire time walking through the streets, restrained, visible, and helpless. The route was predetermined. From the Campus Martis, through the Circus Maximus, past the Forum, up to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Every step would have been witnessed. Every witness would have been Roman. But this sequence required preparation. Captives had to be transported from conquered territories to Rome, a journey that could take weeks by ship. They had to be held in secure locations near the city. They had to be kept alive, presentable, and unable to escape. For Cleopatra, this meant months of waiting, not in Alexandria, in transit, under guard, with no agency and no timeline. And here the Roman calculation became precise. If Cleopatra died before the triumph could still proceed, but it would lack its central figure. If she died during the the spectacle would be disrupted. If she died after the triumph, she would be archived as a completed transaction. Rome preferred the third option, but the second option was acceptable. Only the first option, death before display, would represent failure. That timeline created pressure. Every day Cleopatra remained alive and uncaptured extended the risk that she would find a way to exit the process on her own terms. And Octavian knew she was calculating the same timeline. So he accelerated the preparation. Ships were commissioned. Transport schedules were drafted. Holding facilities in Rome were inspected. The triumph was tentatively scheduled for the following year, but Cleopatra was not informed of these preparations. She was kept in procedural uncertainty because uncertainty prevented planning, and without planning, she could not organize resistance. She could only react. And by the time she understood what was happening, the opportunity to act would have already passed. That was the design. On August 10th, 30 BC, approximately 10 days after the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra died. The method remains debated. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts. Plutarch describes an asp hidden in a basket of figs. Dio Cassius suggests poison. Strabo notes that no snake was found. Some historians propose a hollow hairpin. Others suggest assistance from guards. The mechanism is uncertain. The context is not. Cleopatra died before she could be transported to Rome. And Rome's response to that death reveals what her captivity had actually been designed to achieve. When informed of her death, Octavian did not change the triumph schedule. He adjusted the presentation. On August 13th, 29 BC, nearly 1 year after Cleopatra's death, Octavian celebrated his triple triumph in Rome. The first triumph honored his victories in Illyricum. Second honored Actium. The third honored the conquest of Egypt. For the Egyptian triumph, Cleopatra appeared not in person, as an image. Plutarch records that a large effigy of Cleopatra was carried through the streets, depicting her on a couch with an asp attached. The representation was sufficient. Roman law did not require the actual body of a defeated enemy, only verifiable evidence of their defeat. The effigy provided that evidence, and it carried additional advantages. A living Cleopatra could have displayed resistance,